All right, we're going to move on to our next panel. And our next panel is about environmental and social impacts of biochar in the woods. And we're going to start here with Abby Colehour. Abby, you want to go ahead and share your screen? So Abby is the Restoration Projects Manager for the Long Tom Watershed Council. Abby works as the Restoration Projects specializing in oak, prairie, and wetland ecosystem restoration. They're involved with a range of collaborative projects, including oak woodland thinning, hazardous fuels reduction, reseeding, biochar making, social forestry, vegetation monitoring, targeted animal grazing and browsing, prairie conversions, and management plan writing. Abby is working towards a vision of land management in which ecology and human culture are inextricably linked, starting by uplifting Indigenous leadership and sovereignty. So Abby, please tell us about your work.
Hello, thank you, Kelpie. I'm Abby, as she said, the Restoration Projects Manager for the Long Tom Watershed Council. And I'd like to focus on biochar in the context of our oak and prairie habitat restoration work and some ecological monitoring that we're just starting to do. So spoiler alert, I don't have any answers at this time. We're pretty recent to studying this. So I'll just give you kind of the context and the motivation that led us to start our journey in biochar and some questions that we're asking. So just some context, the whole state of Oregon is covered with watershed councils thanks to some 1990s legislation for the Oregon Plan for the Recovery of Salmon and Watersheds, which started our main funding source, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, who was one of our primary funders for the project I'll be sharing. Oh, and the Long Tom is right here. So generally what we do, we're a nonprofit, non-regulatory, non-governmental organization that works with landowners of various types on a voluntary basis to improve habitat and water quality around our geographic area. So that includes collecting data and doing scientific monitoring, as well as some education and community outreach, and implementing restoration and water quality improvement projects, primarily through grant funding and donations. So this is the Willamette Valley in Oregon. The Long Tom is located in the southern part of the valley here. And this is some ecological context for you on oak and prairie habitats in the valley. So prior to European occupation, the indigenous groups, mostly of the Kalapuya people, various bands of the Kalapuya, were using regular burning to maintain relatively open conditions in the valley. So the brown you see on this map are oak woodlands in the foothills, and then in the valley bottoms here, this yellow is all upland prairie and oak savanna, with the Willamette River and riparian corridors running through here. And you can see in the past 150, 170 plus years, a lot of that original habitat that was maintained for food production and cultural value is almost gone. It's really reduced. So it's considered a high conservation priority due to the amount of biodiversity the habitat support and the extent of the decline. So a lot of that land has been converted to timber production, commercial agriculture, urban and residential growth. The suppression of fire had a significant impact on these habitats, which kept the carbon and vegetation cycling through back into the soil. So with a lack of fire, those open conditions are now filling in with woody plants and overall creating degradation of the ecology, plants, birds, insects that depend on those ecosystems. So there's less than 2% of the prairie and oak savanna and less than 10% of the oak woodlands remaining in the Willamette Valley. So a lot of our restoration work is focusing on those areas that are remnant populations of these ecosystems, and sometimes we're working on kind of converting back to some replication of these ecosystems. So just to reiterate, these habitats are significant for just the sheer biodiversity that they support. Here's a list of just the numerous species that depend on these habitats. Look at how many plants grow in these ecosystems. I'm working hard at learning all of them, but here's some of the characteristics in an oak ecosystem that really support all this life. So again, lack of some kind of disturbance, historically fire, but also mowing and grazing in more modern times has resulted in a lot of these previous historically more open ecosystems filling in with tree and shrub growth like you see here. So this is still there? Hello? Is there a problem with the audio?
No, you're fine. I had to mute somebody, sorry.
Okay, just making sure it's still working. So this is often our starting place for oak and prairie restoration projects. So you've already heard some examples of some of the other presenters sharing about the process of removing trees from the dense overgrowth in these ecosystems. Here's an example from one of our projects. We separate out merchantable trees and sell them if we can to feed back into the project. And then we have to do something with the smaller limbs. We call that slash treatment. And we'll use the same practices conventionally as with a conifer forest, piling and burning, occasionally mulching in place, lopping and scattering, or making wood chip piles for landowners to use. I'll mention too that a lot of these habitats, a significant majority, about 90% in our watershed at least, occur on private lands. So private landowners in our area play a really important role in the restoration of these ecosystems, and that's often who we're working with on these projects. So again, yeah, slash treatment, just one step of many in restoring the resiliency and biodiversity of these ecosystems. We also do invasive species removal, reseeding in disturbed areas with the native plants, and working with landowners to develop a long-term maintenance plan, because these ecosystems depend on regular disturbance. So our journey with biochar started, as many have, with Kelpie Wilson and a workshop she led in 2018 that was well attended by over 70 folks in our area, representing a lot of natural resource professionals, landowners, contractors, etc. Large thanks to my coworker and our ecologist, Katie McKendrick, for putting that together. And we used 6 of these Oregon kiln designs, as previously mentioned. We also practiced some conservation burn piles with existing large heaps of slash that we burned and quenched in place. Our motivation was to improve our practices overall, reduce smoke emissions, reduce carbon emissions, replenish soil conditions, and wanted to just find out what would happen if we make the biochar on site, distribute it on site, and find out what happens to the plant communities. So we designed a 5-year study where we were putting out the biochar that we made through this workshop in 5 different plots on 2 private properties with different treatments. So we had a control plot, we had a biochar only plot, a wood chip only plot, and a biochar and wood chips plot. And we just put it out as large chunks as is and broadcast it with volunteers with buckets. And we did it for that reason, thinking ahead to, if this turns out to be a good idea, we want it to be easily replicable on private lands and encourage a vast diversity of people to utilize this practice. So we wanted it to be simple and low tech. We did vegetation surveys before implementing the biochar on species richness and the percent cover of native and introduced species. And we will do that same survey at the end of the study in a couple of years. We're also taking soil samples for the following information, and we'll analyze what changes, if any, have occurred at the 0 to 2 inch level and the 2 to 6 inch level. And I think we will need to continue beyond that even to see after 5 years how things continue to change. So here's some photos of our plot implementation. We had some happy volunteers assisting us. And just to share too, this wasn't part of our study area, but it's an example of the conservation burn pile footprint afterwards. The landowner who took this photo, Ray Morse, just did a superficial raking of the biochar across this pasture. And this was an area with pretty low plant diversity, which is why the burn pile was located there. Because we're working with remnant plant communities, we are really careful to do plant surveys before any element of our project to make sure we're not negatively impacting remnant native plants that are growing there. And whatever practices we're doing, we try to enhance what's growing there. But in places where it's majority pasture grasses or non-native species, that's a good spot for having a burn pile and reseeding. So here's some of the plants that we will reseed, and we're watching these establish with pretty good success so far. So lessons thus far, as many other people have indicated, biochar takes a lot of time and effort to make, but it's a really fun and engaging tool for education and community engagement. And we have been doing that a lot. It's one of the main uses of our kilns these days, is lending them out to landowners and contractors to do their own experimenting and learning. We need more time and more studies to find out how biochar impacts native plant communities in the Willamette Valley, and that the impacts vary, as other people have mentioned, a lot based on the soil type, the climate, precipitation, what's going on with air quality and smoke regulations. So we're working on developing our own regionally specific best management practices for making and using biochar. And further, biochar can't replace ecological burning as a management practice in the Willamette Valley uplands, which evolved with broad-scale burning, but it might help us restore the conditions to make burning more feasible and effective. So it's one tool in the toolkit. So again, these habitats, the oak and prairie habitats of the Willamette Valley, evolved with culture and a community of people using fire and other mechanisms to sustain the biodiversity for their own use and their own culture, as well as for that of the rest of life. So if we're talking about restoration, we have to talk about restoring those relationships with those people to the place that they're from. So here's a picture of Katie McKendrick, where all this started. And she's now focusing on developing an Indigenous fire practitioners training, or supporting. So this past fall, she put on the first Indigenous fire practitioners training to just encourage Native folks to rekindle that relationship with fire and use it on the land. So we were able to do 12 acres of burning under their leadership just outside of Eugene this year. So what's next? We plan to continue our study of biochar in oak woodland context. We're also working with our urban waters program to find out how biochar can be used in stormwater filtration. It's another area of focus. And we have some more questions. How can biochar be integrated with grazing? How does it affect invasive species growing in our area? Blackberry, Scotch broom, thistles, invasive annual grasses, etc. What happens if we put out biochar and then do a prescribed burn? What happens if we put biochar in a prairie or a wetland that doesn't have a lot of woody growth? So let me know if you're interested in these questions and you are local to this area or have interest in this area. I think that is all I have for you.
Abby, thank you so much. That's fantastic. I'm really happy to hear your updates and where you're going and your research questions, all very, very important. So our next speaker is Gloria Flora. And Gloria, can you go ahead and share your screen, please? Make sure we can get this all going. I know we have a little bit of a challenge. Excellent. All right. Okay, so Gloria is the Executive Director of Sustainable Obtainable Solutions. In her 22-year career with the U.S. Forest Service, Gloria Flora became nationally known for her leadership in ecosystem management and for her courageous principled stands. As supervisor of the Lewis and Clark National Forest in north central Montana, she made a landmark decision to prohibit natural gas leasing along the spectacular 356,000 acre Rocky Mountain front near the Bob Marshall Wilderness, a place often described as an American Serengeti for its abundant populations of wildlife, birds, and fish. In 2001, she founded and now directs Sustainable Obtainable Solutions, an organization dedicated to the sustainability of public lands and of the plants, animals, and communities that depend on them. Then in 2009, she founded the US Biochar Initiative and has been deeply involved in biochar education and biochar industry development for more than a decade. Gloria, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Really, really happy to have you here today.
Oh, my pleasure, Kelpie, and truly my pleasure to listen to all the presentations that have been given so far today. Really enlightening, and it's so exciting when you think back to 2009, when I know many of you were involved in biochar at the time, and you could walk into a room, ask anybody if they knew what biochar was, and there'd be like maybe one hand raised. So we've made huge strides, and it's all very exciting. I can't seem to get rid of this little menu down here at the bottom that I'm not sure where to put it. It looks obnoxious, but oh well, we'll live with it because I don't know what else.
Gloria, back off from your mic a little bit. You might be clearer.
Oh, sure. No, is that better?
Maybe. Go ahead. It's fine.
Try that?
Yes, much better.
This? Okay. All right. Today I'd like to talk about fire ecology restoration project that the Permaculture Institute of North America is leading, focusing on developing social forestry as a permaculture practice. And I'm involved in this because I'm helping the Permaculture Institute of North America right now as their development officer. And we did get private foundation funding for this, and I am not able to advance my screen. Oh, there it goes. So what is permaculture? Permaculture is a holistic ecological design system, and it really focuses on resilience, regeneration, conservation, and cooperation within communities of both nature and people. So it's a social and an ecological design system. And it really focuses on or incorporates the regional location values, and that's social and economic and ecological as well, ecosystem models, biomimetic practices by watching patterns in natures and communities, and drawing on that traditional ecological knowledge, some of what Amy was talking about, and on modern science. PINA is the Permaculture Institute of North America, and it's a nonprofit professional organization, trade association technically, and we're focused on bringing permaculture solutions to social justice, land regeneration, and climate cooling challenges, and we exist to ensure that the integrity and quality of permaculture information and design is maintained, and we also train, develop, promote, and network permaculture professionals. Permaculture is really about whole systems thinking. It's looking at inputs and outputs, the elements and context, patterns, as I said, relationships, cause and effect. And I don't think any of this is new to anybody, but I'm just trying to frame what it is that we're doing in the larger picture here. When we're working in forests, we're talking really about ecosystem management, not just forest management. And there's three dimensions of ecosystem management: the physical, the biological, and the human. And they all need to be treated equally, assessed, and responded to effectively. I think we've all heard many examples today of people working with communities of people and place. So a lot of this work happens in the WUI and the wildland-urban interface, and a lot of it with private landowners as well as public land management. And besides working with those communities, what we're really trying to do in working with them is to protect our ecosystem services. And I think everybody is pretty familiar with ecosystem services, but essentially that's all the tricks that nature can perform for us that we cannot replicate feasibly, such as produce oxygen, absorb CO2, clean and filter water and recycle water through the hydrologic cycle, encourage habitats and relationships between, and symbiotic relationships between species, and then special tricks like pollination and managing decay and the recycling of resources, and then the system support that we've talked about, the carbon cycle, hydrologic cycle, et cetera. So those are services that we definitely want to protect. So what's the problem? Well, the problem on the physical and biological level are that we have over 100 years of fire suppression, which has increased tree density. That increase in tree density tends to favor shade-tolerant trees, which have a lower fire tolerance. That increases competition, so there's less water and nutrients per tree, making them more susceptible to drought stress, insects, disease, yielding higher mortality. Those trees fall over and increase the fuel loading. So we have this feedback loop that's actually a negative feedback loop for what we're trying to accomplish, and our forests have then become much more susceptible to uncharacteristic fire behavior. But of the forests that supply clean water in the West, and that is most of them, that are at a high risk of wildfire, over 40% are private and family owned. And this is really significant because much of our attention is directed towards public lands, but private lands really are holding the key in many places. So in permaculture, we always say the problem is the solution. So what are we going to do? Well, our fire ecology restoration project is focused primarily on involving private forest landowners in forest restoration and resilience on their own properties. We believe, like many others on this call have articulated, that when you engage the forest landowner in a meaningful way, not just acquiescing, but getting excited, enthusiastic, and engaged in being stewards and increasing the resilience of their properties, that we are going to do a lot more or have a lot more value supplied by these people by breaking up the continuity of fuels and creating virtual fire breaks when we have more characteristic fire characteristics and or occurrences. And that said, we've seen plenty of examples of where there have been these effective treatments that have really influenced fire behavior, such as cooling the fire, getting it back down on the ground, allowing better access for firefighters. But when you have severe conditions, there's really not a whole lot you can do. You can just keep your fingers crossed that the fire severity will not be so intense in these areas that have been treated that we have protected at least the soils and can expect some regeneration from them. So the FERP elements, what we're looking at, of course, with a goal of landscape resilience, is first the site assessment, where we're looking at the physical and social elements and the capabilities, both physically and socially, which involves everything from the landowner's desires to the labor and money to actually implement change, plus what the land is willing and capable of doing with a little bit of help. As far as increasing the beneficial site potential, we want to manage biomass and precipitation and build soil. And how do we manage precipitation? Well, we manage it on the receiving end. As has been pointed out, the ability of biochar to help retain soil moisture is huge. One of the other features that we're including in our FERP activities is to use on-contour logs for the larger materials that we're not changing into biochar for capturing surface water, for reducing erosion, and for creating those little shade areas, right, for the interface of where the log is meeting the soil. And of course, with biochar, we're building soil. Another really important feature that's been mentioned but deserves repeating is that when you're looking at prescriptions of what you're going to do, you not only have a silvicultural prescription, but you have a fuels prescription. How much of that residual fuel are you leaving on the ground for all the positive and beneficial things that material on the ground, biomass, lends to soils and forest health? And what we hope to accomplish by this is ecosystem restoration, where we have revived the native vegetation, given a leg up to the more resilient fire-tolerant species, and having connectivity in the habitat for both large mammals as well as our smaller friends. And the landscape resilience, but also that research element. And I think we've had some excellent examples from projects that have been underway or are nearing completion where they did include a research element so that we could help answer some really critical questions. So I think what we're seeing in common with a lot of these projects is that they are involving both people and nature. And by taking the permaculture approach, we really want to underscore people, and we want to underscore that holistic design. So on the people side, we're engaging landowners to help reduce wildfire risk, especially with that restoration focus, providing direct assistance and advice. In our case, in FERP, we've hired and we're training 9 crew leaders in ecosystem and forest health, site assessments, prescriptions, and biochar production and use, of course, all with an eye towards sustainability. We expect the leaders then to lead crews that will thin, reduce biomass, make biochar, and distribute it back in the forest. Those crews we initially expect to be AmeriCorps or Oregon Conservation Corps, because this project is in southern Oregon. But our ideal is to create local crews, particularly reaching out to underserved youth and providing them a training and potential career opportunities by connecting them and their communities to these landscapes. Obviously, the natural the benefits that we're doing are reducing wildfire risk, improving visual quality in habitats, and I want to stress the visual quality. People live in the wildland-urban interface because they're enchanted with the appearance of the place. They love the wildlife that they see, and so we really need to focus on visual quality as well as habitat quality so that A, you meet the landowner's desires, but B, because when others landowners see what is being done, it's very infectious. I've seen it here in my own neighborhood. We now have 4 neighbors with cojoined boundaries that have all done significant wildfire risk reduction work on their properties. And the more people see it, the more they say, I want my property to look like that. So advertising as well as beneficial for the environment. We're converting biomass to biochar on site, using that to improve soil and moisture retention, for distribution, again, the on-contour logs, for erosion control, and then research our processes as well as the effects, and then apply and share those findings. We are fortunate enough to be using the Ring of Fire. Thank you, Kelpie. And what we were doing on this particular site is we were hot loading green material. It's primarily manzanita, oak, and some small Doug fir, and fairly dry materials to begin with. And it was very successful, according to the crew. and according to the results, we got a lot of biochar out of this burn, but it kept 9 people very busy to be scurrying around and making sure that they were, keeping the fire going. And they were going further than that 55 feet, the sweet spot that Mark Vandermeer was talking about. But they eliminated the piling and the second handling of the slash. And we think that's a really good way to go, because when you look at the labor cost, when you have to handle that material 2, 3, 4 times as you sort, pile, swamp, etc., you may be seeing a cost savings if you crew with young legs and strong backs to be scurrying back and forth and chucking the slash right into the kiln without piling first. And then here's a sample of the biochar that's ready for distribution onto the forest floor. And this has we have a design for that as well, and that is that we're focusing on preferred species, on drought-stressed species, and we've been very curious about how people are distributing. The wheelbarrow idea I like. Wondering about a wagon where you have one person pulling and another person alongside shoveling biochar out, so that you don't have to keep switching your tools. So we're interested in learning more, and we expect to be doing that through conversations with a lot of the presenters today. So socioeconomic, let me pull this down, that still doesn't work, and ecological research. Some of the options and outcomes that we're looking for is quantifying how waste becomes a resource with economic value. We have a leg up from a lot of you folks who have done that, and a lot of studies about that already. We're looking at air quality and carbon neutrality. How do we assure that so we can support human ecosystem health and climate stability, and provide some assurances to regulators so that they can issue permits based on real data, not just on, well, it looks like a burn barrel to me, which is quite often the response we get. Can we make carbon credits quantifiable and assignable? What appropriate equipment matches the feedstock that we have, along with the topography and the ecosystem, so we can get maximum efficiency? And then land managers can contractually specify clean, efficient equipment and ecological outcomes with some degree of confidence. And you can see the difficulty of that. I mean, Lori's presentation and with what NRCS is grappling with really points out, when you try to really dial it in and get those specs, that, in permaculture we say it depends. Well, so a lot depends when you're developing these specs on a lot of the site characteristics that can't all conveniently be named. And then businesses. We want to give businesses that are in the forest restoration business the appropriate tools for sustainable outcomes, output data, and jobs, and so they can make a profit. Okay, let's quit advancing. Maybe something about this little feature. Okay, I've stalled out, so I'm going to try this again. If I can make it go forward. Ah, yes. The very important thing. For more information, you can contact myself, and there's my email, as well as Melanie Midland, who is our project leader. And then as a little bonus, should you download this presentation to view later, I have a fairly comprehensive set of additional resources looking at biomass to biochar sustainability guidelines for individuals and businesses. And so we look at physical, biological, human, some engineering and ecological imperatives, and then addressing the triple bottom line that looks at the at human economics and planet, people, and profit, essentially, and then some guidelines for sustainable biochar production for industries and business. So there's your bonus features. act now, or no, wait, there's more. Anyhow, thank you very much. End of presentation, and I look forward to any questions folks might have.
Thank you, Gloria. That was a really good summary, and those resources will be useful for people, especially anybody who's maybe wanting to write a grant proposal, you know, and needs a good summary overview. So thank you, Gloria. Hang on now, we've got one more presenter. People, please put your questions in the Q&A for Gloria and for Abby. And the next person I want to introduce is Dylan Percival Maxwell. Dylan is the co-founder and CEO of CarbonFace. And Dylan has been a committed environmentalist for 3 decades. He opened Quebec's first eco-boutique selling organic clothes in Montreal in the 1990s. He was the first in Canada to publicly run a car on used vegetable oil and instigated Canada's first biodiesel pilot project in coordination with Montreal's Public Bus Corporation. So if Montreal smells like French fries, I guess you have Dylan to thank. This project resulted in 265,000 fewer tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. He was also a Green Party of Canada candidate 5 times, including in 2000 when he was the first Green Party candidate to get more votes than both the Conservatives and the NDP. All right, well, Dylan, welcome. And I guess you're going to share your screen?
Yes, I just clicked it. Is it?
There you go.
There we go.
View. Here comes
Okay.
your screen.
Yeah, you guys in the middle of it somehow, but
And I'm really excited to hear what you're going to tell us about, because I don't know much about it. So, but it looks so interesting to me. When I was attended the Business of Biochar conference in early December, and I heard Dylan speak, I thought we've got to get him on this in this Biochar in the Woods day. So thanks for joining us.
thank you. So CarbonFace.org is a biochar-based social network and a carbon removal token exchange platform. So these tokens, you can buy them here. This is my website, obviously. You can sell them here. A better place to buy them is the Unmining tab, where you can see different people who are what I call unmining, who are bearing biochar. What got me going in this to do this was for years I was selling carbon negative biochar producing cook stoves in Asia, and these people they produce hardly any carbon themselves, and if they have one of these stoves, they're actually carbon negative, but they get no support for what they're doing for the world, and usually they can't even afford a $30 cook stove. So we're kind of like the Airbnb of biochar carbon removal credits. Like with you know, if you need to basically to be bearing about 100 tons a year, I'm told, to make it worthwhile to go with the big guys, which is, you know, Puro.Earth and Carbon Future. So obviously there's a lot of other people who are bearing biochar, and there's actually almost 1 billion farmers in the world. So if, you know, 1 billion farmers or anywhere close, obviously, start bearing biochar, we can take a lot of carbon out of the air and do a lot of good things. And of course, money is a motivator, and getting credit for what you do is a motivator. So I set up this platform to support everyone who's not producing 100 tons a year, which is everyone here. So what actually sparked the idea was cryptocurrency. New Bitcoins are created when people who call themselves miners solve pointless mathematical puzzles, which create huge amounts of energy. So instead, why not have a coin which gets minted when people who we call unminers bury biochar? They're also coincidentally, you know, when you bury biochar, you're doing the opposite of what a coal miner does. You're burying carbon in the ground. We call this coin a char ton or char kilo if it's a smaller amount. And 1 char ton represents 1 ton of biochar being put in the ground. We find this is more true and accurate than going with a CO2 equivalent, because we're not doing all the testing of the carbon, you know, the exact carbon in the biochar you made. But people, as Kelpie said earlier, 1 ton of biochar basically equals 2.5 kilos of CO2 equivalent, but we're sort of promising what we can promise, which is how much biochar in the ground. So although char tons are digital currency, it's not really relevant in a way. We focus on the fact that they're a carbon offset, a carbon removal token. That's our focus, and it doesn't really matter about the other stuff. So our first task is to award enough char ton tokens to people like you, people here who bury biochar or thinking about burying biochar, so that we have enough so we don't sell out. I mean, we have a bunch up there now, but we haven't started marketing yet. And before you sell anything, you want to make sure you have enough that you don't sell out immediately. So I'm asking you to help us get the ball rolling and to join our social network, post what you do. And I'm confident that, you know, there'll be some money, maybe not a lot, but some money coming to you eventually if you do that. Well, if you decide to sell them, because you might want to just post and keep those carbon credits for yourself. This is a big project, and I can understand if you might have skepticism. I don't always come off as the most professional speaker. I have a speech impediment and dyslexic, but I'm quite good at actually getting things done, like the 250,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, which we managed to remove due to the pilot project, well, the project with the city bus company of Montreal, etc. So let me show you how this works. So this is the website. The first thing you want to do is you want to join the social. I mean, maybe you want to read up, which is fine. It takes a few seconds to create a new, well, not just a few minutes to create a new social profile for yourself. Please post a picture like is regularly done in Facebook. As you can see, it's basically a Facebook copy. So, you know, which makes it a lot easier to understand, and it was something new. If you want to get back to the regular site, you can go to sequester carbon, or there's a number of places you can click, like here. This is kind of hidden, or you can click here. If you want to unmine, you click that button, and this is where you click quantity that you produced, and it's in kilos, so that anybody that work with people in Africa and stuff, some people produce obviously less than a ton. So you know, you can make your own estimate there. Now we'll probably reward you slightly less than what you actually bury, because we want to err on the side of caution. We work on, unfortunately, you know, you usually put out biochar with water, so you can't really use weight. So though this is calculated in weight, but we calculate 18 liters, you know, one basically 5-gallon bucket, to be equal to 1 kilo of biochar. This is from my own, just the biochar I make in the stoves I sell, weighing it. These are fairly large pieces. So again, it's kind of underestimates. I assume we will later have a different number we use for, you know, if you're making like a powder. So you just put up what you think, and we'll put in what you'll get what we think. And then in the end, the customer will decide if it's like Airbnb. They'll look at all the information on your timeline and decide if they trust you and who they want to give to. The rest is pretty simple. The location, the notes, the more you put into the notes, the better. But you don't need to put anything really. Well, something. The videos, unfortunately, if you click here, it doesn't work. You have to click on this little the actual video camera thing for it to work. Now, you don't actually need, well, you need to put in a video for the thing to work. But if you have just photos of what you've done, you can put in any sort of video, and it'll show up in your timeline. So you want to hide, if you put in a video of your floor, obviously you want to hide it from your timeline. But we work on common sense. Now, people in and our verification will probably get more difficult as time goes on. And so for people in Africa or any country, going back to the main site here, any country where they sell charcoal for cooking, we have to be more careful because it might be tempting for somebody to make the biochar and get the credit for it and get paid for it, and then sell the charcoal to be used for cooking, and then of course the carbon goes back in the air, and that's obviously what we don't want. So for people in countries like this, this is Kenneth, who's one of our unminers. He's been great. So he, you can see the big pile of biochar in the back, and these bags, so I can measure how much. But we only gave him the char kilos for the amount that he actually buried in the ground, because that way, it's a lot of work. Hopefully it's manure or something like that, and there's no way they would take it out. I trust Kenneth, but I want to show him, how to do it so other people trust him, and that it can't be re-sowed twice. The demand for these for carbon credits is actually bigger than supply, but most of the unminers will not be certified. So the other companies, there's a big demand for companies buying certified carbon credits. Now, Warm Heart actually, which is basically the same thing as Biochar Trust, they will very soon be certified by the EDC, but most of other people will not be certified. So we'll be looking for a different market. We have a bunch of different marketing plans. The one we're most excited about is this, which is contacting companies who make a product and offering them free carbon footprint of that product if they either offset themselves or place this logo on their product. And actually, we just started talking to a few coffee companies, and one's already interested. So there seems to be a good interest, because this will really, nobody's done this before, so this will really make their product stand out compared to others. And this itself actually might have more of a big effect on slowing climate change than the biochar that we encourage to be buried. I mean, one day, for sure, in my opinion, all products will have to have the carbon footprint on it. Right now, it's literally like shopping without the price. I mean, it's like going to the supermarket. How do you shop properly? How do you make sure you don't spend too much when you don't know the price? So right now, we don't know the carbon price. So when people see this on a product, they'll think, first of all, if they like this kind of thing, they'll think, oh, maybe I'll buy this product. What a good idea. And they'll also think about their footprint, and to think about maybe thinking about what they're buying and the carbon footprint of it. And then they'll actually have the information, especially when it is more than one product with this, with the carbon listed. They'll have the actual information to make a choice. Right now, there is a carbon neutral logo which people stamp, which companies can buy, but of course most companies can't afford any more costs. Microsoft can, but one of the beauties of this idea is that people will be able to, companies, they can offset themselves, offset half themselves, or just pass it on to the customer and let the customer do it or not. So and we have lots of marketing ideas, but this is one of them. And that's a big part of what we're doing, is that we want to encourage the people to offset the carbon footprint, to that of course too, but to calculate the carbon footprint. So here on our carbon footprint page, I don't know if any of you, I imagine some of you have calculated your carbon footprint. Here's a place you can do it. Obviously, the more people pay for, if you're paying an extra $300 every time you take a flight, you're going to take less flights. And if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, you got to know what you're doing is making what reaction in terms of carbon. And so I encourage everyone to join the site, obviously, and to post videos or pictures of the carbon you bury and keep track of that. A lot of presenters already have, and compare that to your carbon footprint. And if you are not offsetting your whole carbon footprint, then to support other unminers, be in Africa or whatever. And one of the important things about this, it's not just about getting paid. Like in Africa, they're interested in getting paid, but here it's not necessarily going to be that much money, but it's going to add to other money coming in, grants. But it also creates a critical mass and makes a community. You know, I was the first person to run a car on vegetable in Canada, and for the first 5 years, you know, people thought it was a joke. Nobody really believed it. But then when it was, 20 people, then more people started doing it. So the more people, let's say, you tell somebody about biochar, it's like, okay. And then if they go and you say, well, you can look at my site, you can look at the site. Then they go there and they see, oh, not only you're doing it, but all these other people are doing it. And this person's right next to me, and they can share information. And it gets a community and a critical mass to really make the thing grow. So even if you're not that interested in making a few extra bucks or offsetting your own footprint or keeping track of it, it's great if you can join and do that. And you don't have to. Some people say, well, I want to keep my offsets for myself, and that's fine. You don't have to sell them. You can keep them forever, your tokens. I encourage you to sell at least a bit of it, so that if they click on your profile, they have a chance to buy some, and you can experiment. The right now on the other sites,
Dylan?
it goes for about $100.
Dylan?
$100 per ton of CO2 equivalent, which equals about $250 per ton of biochar, which is about 25%, 25 cents per kilo. So you can. One of the advantages, we hope to get some of those big industrial producers as well on our site, though we don't expect to get too many of those guys. But one of the advantages is that you can, compared to those other guys, is you can sell in whatever quantity you want. So you can put up, let's say you make 700 kilos, you could put up 50 kilos at 25 cents a kilo and see if it sells.
Dylan?
I
Hello,
encourage you to do
Dylan.
that and maybe put some more up at a price that would actually encourage you to make biochar quicker than you would otherwise do. So maybe.
Oh, Dylan, can you hear us?
At $10, and you might say, well, who's going to buy them for $10? And you're probably right. But if you tell your friends, you're not going to tell your friends, hey, can you give me money? I'm burying some biochar. But you might tell your friends, hey, I'm on this site. And then they might look at it and go, oh, I'm going to give so-and-so $20 for what they do. Why not?
Hey, Dylan. Yes, your time is up. Yes, your time is up, buddy.
Oh, I turned my sound off. That's why I can't hear. So is my time up? Is that why you're waving at me?
Yes, sir, it is up.
I forgot to turn on my timer. So thank you.
Sorry, Dylan, we probably started a bit late too, but we are getting to the end of this panel, and we want to have some time for questions. Dylan, we'll be sending your contact information to everybody, but carbonface.org, do you have a contact place there on your website where people could get in touch with you to ask questions directly?
Yeah, well, of course, they can join the social and contact me,
Okay.
you can me on the social or dylan.carbonface@gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I think there's some questions for you. So if you want to unshare your screen, we'll get to a few questions before we move into our final panel of the day. And so where's the Q&A again? Thanks, Dylan. That was really, really interesting. It's obviously a really big topic. So I've got a question here going back to Abby. Walt wants to know, do you have any early impressions regarding the control char mulch plus char experiment? He's very interested in this result and hoping that the mix is as useful as the mulch and more persistent. So Abby, if you want to share any of your impressions, obviously no statistics yet, but do you have any, or is it too early to tell?
I really don't. And it was affirming too, in not having anything to say about it, to hear that it took over 5 years for another panelist study before anything was really noticeable. So especially because we put out large chunks of char, it's going to take longer. So I'm sorry, but stay tuned.
Great. And, you know, Walt, if you missed Deb Dumrose's presentation this morning, you know, we are going to send a recording to everybody. So I would recommend you check hers out, because she's showing some really nice results. She's been at it longer than anybody, and she's got some results, especially, you know, for revegetation. All right. And let's see. Des has a question for you too, Abby. What's your expectation regarding biochar penetration into the soil after top dressing? So you just mentioned it's bigger chunks, but are there fines as well? Do you think it's going to be moving into the soil profile?
I think I would expect that the top 2 inches will have the most change after 5 years. So we took soil samples for 2 inches down, and then the following 4 inches below that. So I would expect in 5 years we would see maybe some kind of change in soil factors in those 2 inches.
And that's the larger size?
Yeah, and it was just, we didn't filter or screen or anything. It's just whatever came out of the kiln. So there is a mix of there's some ash in there, but we did leave the biochar out over a winter. So it the rain kind of probably washed away a lot of the fine material. So then whatever was remaining, we put out on the ground.
Great, thank you. And there's a kind of complicated question here from Rocky, who's asking, how do you compare the kilns with prescribed burns? So first part of the question is a kiln used to char easily collected material, you know, larger brush, et cetera, in order to maximize biochar yield? And then is a prescribed burn then used to clear more entangled or lighter brush, which could be more infeasible to deposit in a kiln, with the drawback that biochar yield is minimal, and with the advantage that heat selects for plants and seeds that benefit from periodic fire and ash? So I guess basically the question is, how can we work these two techniques together? And I think you've thought about that a bit, right?
Yeah, if someone else has an answer, also feel free to add that. But if we can do a prescribed burn, we will. That's definitely number one priority. So, and fire needs some kind of standing fuel to carry it. So we do plan our restoration actions, including biochar, according to whether and when we expect to do a prescribed burn. So we'll let the shrubs grow. We need to reduce the fuel ladder so that if we do a burn, it's not getting into the canopy of trees. We want it to stay in the understory. So yeah, we probably wouldn't do a focused biochar operation in a place that we want to burn within the next couple of years. We would probably choose to do that somewhere where a burn is not going to be feasible, or that we won't be doing in the next 5 or so years.
What I kind of hear though is maybe some of the bigger material that's ladder fuels, you might remove that first before you do a prescribed burn.
Yes, and that is the order of operations for a densely overgrown oak woodland. We'll do a restoration thinning, remove the larger materials, and some of that we can turn into biochar. I don't know what would happen if we did turn that larger material into biochar, put it back out there, and then did a burn. We haven't tried that yet.
Mm-hmm. And it might just be a matter of waiting the right interval so it gets incorporated in the soil and moistened so it doesn't reburn. And the whole topic of prescribed burning is something I just want to comment here, very interesting to me. There's a lot of new papers, research papers showing that actually natural wildfire deposits a lot of charcoal, and maybe there are techniques and ways to do prescribed burns that could maximize the charcoal production. So, you know, it's just another area that's really interesting we could get into at some point. Let's see, I've got a question now for Dylan. So Dylan, why are you really is your tokens represent the biochar that's buried rather than the carbon equivalents, the CO2, which is
Well,
how other carbon offsets are measured. Can you just
right.
address that?
Sure. Well, the big guys, you know, they have so much bureaucracy that it doesn't. People who do less than 100 tons can't really apply. And part of that is testing the carbon to see the carbon content. So, you know, when a farmer buries some biochar in Africa, I can't ask them to send it into a lab for carbon content. So I don't feel comfortable saying that, you know, this is exactly this much CO2. I feel much more comfortable saying we know this is this much biochar. And it's also easier for people to, it's also something physical. I mean, when you talk about carbon offsets, a lot of people go, you know, and also compared to carbon offsets, I mean, planting trees is a great thing, but it's not really the best for carbon offsets for a number of reasons. But this is physical biochar being buried in the ground, so it's very, you know, you can see it, so it's more concrete. I mean, maybe I'll end up.
I'd like to make a comment too about that, Dylan, where what I think is valuable about what you're doing is that, you know, the carbon accounting involves, you know, the footprint for producing the biochar, but it doesn't really account for the benefits of putting biochar in the soil. So yeah, you're bypassing that whole question, which I love. So now we have to move on to the next panel. So thank you, panelists, for this panel. And we will, there was a question also about Gloria's presentation. We are going to collect the presentations and send them all to you as soon as we get them. So you'll have access to that. So thank you, panel.